You're listening to eCommerce Fastlane, the podcast show to help you build, manage, grow, and scale a successful and thriving company, powered by Shopify. Listen to real conversations with partners and subject matter experts as they share proven practical strategies, platforms, and the best Shopify apps to help you accelerate your business. The time is now for you to improve efficiencies, grow revenue, profit, and lifetime customer loyalty. Please welcome your host, startup founder and strategic advisor, Steve Hutt.
Well, Temi, thanks so much for joining me today on eCommerce Fastlane. I really am thrilled to kind of dive into your e-commerce journey. I kind of creeped on your LinkedIn profile kind of before recording, and you've had quite a storied career. It's very, very interesting. Some of the incredible brands that you've had the good fortune of working with. And I'd like to really kick off this conversation. If you could maybe share what initially drew you to this industry, and your experience, obviously, at Estee Lauder and a lot of other notable companies, I believe have shaped your current role as a fractional marketing executive and an advisor at Blacksmith Consulting. So I just would like to understand and get a lay of the land about what initially drew you to this market.
So what's interesting is that I started my career at Lord & Taylor, which was a retailer based primarily in the Northeast. And a lot of the marketing initiatives that I worked on there was primarily support in store. What's also interesting is I was there during the pivotal moment when they made the shift to kind of growing the e-commerce business. And when I say it was early stages, we're talking about we didn't have an online warehouse or fulfillment came from stores, and really just even trying to allocate inventory numbers to support e-commerce. And so what I loved about it and what it kind of, sparked my interest was the ability to kind of have almost a direct data points of what a customer is doing. So whether that be them coming to the website, making a purchase, not necessarily having the delay that you would normally have with sales and relationships that would happen in store. And so that kind of, was very exciting for me. And so I kind of made the pivot to really being in e-commerce for, the past 12 plus years. Primarily, I started at Estee Lauder, working on the actual Estee Lauder brand. And then I was also there during a pivotal moment there too, because, as you know, for all, the ELC brands, the majority of them are in their retail locations. So you're thinking, Macy's, Bloomingdale's, Lord & Taylor was also one of their retailers. And there was a huge kind of focus and initiative in terms of growing online division. And so there's a lot of investment in resources. And I saw, the significant growth that happened over the 7 years that I was there. And so while I had, experience and exposure to really large companies from Lord & Taylor to Estee Lauder, what I really found invigorating and very much, inciting and what I wanted to do was really move to smaller brands. So smaller brands that didn't necessarily have the brand equity that you kind of think of a legacy brand like Estee Lauder and other brands in their portfolio, but were able to kind of weed through kind of the noise of direct marketing to be able to kind of grow and scale their businesses. And so that included me, immediately after Estee Lauder going to Swell, which, is a brand that was known for one of the pioneers of the reusable stainless steel water bottles, and really kind of shifting and transforming the business to be a digital first business, where in that instance, it was a brand that wasn't necessarily first and foremost e-commerce. Most of people's, direct relationship with Swell was primarily through wholesale or swag that they would get from, whether their gym, their company, et cetera. And so I've pretty much been on the track of staying e-commerce, loving and watching the evolution of it. So there was a period of time where it was still early. No one wanted to touch it. Every, businesses felt that it was, competing with the other sales channels to it being the key focus area. And now we're in a moment where, I want to say it's shifting back, but being omnichannel is really much key in terms of you can't really grow aggressively your business solely based on D2C and being heavily reliant on a lot of the channels that a lot of us were relying on, Meta, Google, et cetera, because it just has not become, it's become not cost effective to kind of only be a D2C brand.
Now, you've worked with a diverse range of brands, from startups all the way through to Fortune 500 companies. And so I'd love to hear it from your perspective. How does your approach to full funnel marketing, how does it differ from maybe scaling a D2C brand from maybe 10 million all the way up to $100 million, maybe compared to what it's like working with an established enterprise?
So when you're thinking about brands that are newer to market, I'm talking like, less than 10 years, a lot of what they're focused on is like, how do they address a need, right? Address a need in the market that whether customers may not realize exists, or it's always been a need that they haven't had a product that satisfies their problem. And so a lot of the early, when you think about full funnel, very much focus on some elements of brand and like the connection to, fostering that relationship with customers. But a huge portion of it in the early stages is actually conversion, right? And so much of the emphasis in dollars is in the bottom of the funnel. Whereas like when you're looking at more established brands, it's really maintaining the brand equity. And so there's a lot, while you're still investing in both from the top of funnel brand consideration, as well as, ultimately the bottom in terms of conversion, the mix is a lot different. And what I would actually argue, in this place where like there are brands popping up and, the area that I'm most familiar with is beauty. I mean, there are, hundreds and hundreds of different beauty brands. The reality is, for any kind of problem that someone has, there are multiple brands that can satisfy it. And so what makes someone connect to your brand is actually the relationship to your brand, the relationship to the story, and also just really having connection to the brand equity. And so what we're seeing, especially now, with the cost of like the lower conversion, and really, a lot of the emphasis on the discounting in terms of first purchase, et cetera, is really more a shift to like, in order for long-term and both sustainable growth, there needs to be a heavy emphasis in brand building, both on the small scale in terms of startups, as well as in, what it's been the formula for established brands.
As you're well aware, the e-commerce landscape really is constantly evolving. And like, from your perspective, from your lens, like, what are some of the most significant changes that you've kind of observed kind of in this direct-to-consumer strategy over the last few years? And how can brands kind of stay ahead of the curve?
So I think given some of the changes that I mentioned, how do brands kind of stay ahead, right? And I think one of those elements is leaning on each other. And that is, I'm part of different kind of groups and organizations, and it's really bouncing ideas off each other. What worked for us, what didn't work for us. And people, focus on D2C e-commerce as well as, omnichannel brands. And then the other component is creating and fostering a culture where people can test and learn. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the huge emphasis of like, can you prove the cost benefit for this, et cetera? A lot of things can't really pass that test, right? But they do have, a way that kind of grows and scales the business. And so fostering culture where you can test and learn things and learn quickly, adjust, and then test something else, and I also think the other element is, the way customers are shopping is different, and it's constantly evolving. TikTok Shop was not a thing, a few years ago. And for some brands, it works very well. For some, it doesn't. And so that's kind of the element when I'm talking about testing new, whether it be platforms or where the customer is actually shopping, to be able to kind of stay ahead of a lot of these changes that have occurred in the landscape and will continue to occur.
Now, Temi, you clearly are very passionate about creating, engaging digital experiences for brands over the years. And can you kind of walk us through a specific case study where you significantly improved either the customer engagement and how that impacted the brand's bottom line?
So because I'm someone who's been in kind of this area for a while, I've been through multiple site redesigns and as well as rebrands that have happened over the course of my career. And so the emphasis of kind of creating engaging digital experiences kind of translate what someone would get if they were shopping in store, an example of beauty, or in just like an element of giving them a little bit more than they would if they were just shopping anywhere else. And so one example of that is, while I was at Swell, there was an initial investment, which the first ever kind of brand campaign that happened in the beginning of 2020. And the campaign was, centered on more ways to use less. And so that included a lot of different components of like out of home. We took an installation in Union Square, different places between DC and Chicago, also how out of home components. And there was also kind of a digital execution of that as well. And so all those things were driving traffic to the website. And so it was kind of key and pivotal to refresh what the website looked like in the look and feel, but also make it easy for customers to convert. And so, because we're essentially driving all this additional traffic of people who may have not heard from the brand before or have heard, but may have not purchased. And so in this example, what I worked on was the overall customer journey and what that looked like on the website, with the assumption of that we would be getting people who weren't familiar with the brand, as well as people who may have heard about the brand years ago, but had never purchased. And so a lot of that was, what does the homepage look like? How does the flow look from the product collections pages? How do we kind of educate the value in terms of the technology of our products, but also the overall beauty of Swell in terms of it being a fashion accessory that helps you kind of contribute to minimizing waste in the environment. And so the element of that was very exciting, which, this, as I mentioned, has occurred in 2020. So it's full throttle when we entered the pandemic was, the campaign drove, an increase in traffic in Q1 of upwards of 30%. And what we saw is, even with that, no new products were, in the market. We didn't launch any new products. We pretty much had our regular assortment. Online also experienced, plus 4 to 5% in sales in the first month. And so it really kind of emphasizes that as you think about, as I mentioned, the full funnel marketing, it's like, yes, there's an element of getting the customer to know about your brand, the element of driving them to your website or any location, but then what is the experience when they land there? And how do you create an experience that is matches however which way they came through, but also provides, enough education, enough information, engagement to kind of keep them through the funnel to ultimately convert.
Now, as you're well aware, data-driven decisions really are crucial in today's day and age in e-commerce. And what are some of the key metrics that you focus on when you're optimizing for the customer journey? And then how do you translate these KPIs to actionable strategies for brand marketers?
As I mentioned earlier, data is very much key and crucial in e-commerce and making decisions based on the data. And so key metrics, I would kind of put them in two buckets. So one is, it's like, what is overall traffic to your website? How's that trending over time? What is the conversion rate on your website overall? How's that trending over time, as well as by channel, right? And then the other component is abandonment. And everything's going to be relevant and benchmarked to your existing business, but how many people are actually leaving your website that are coming? And then the other is, what is our AOV for first purchases or just existing customers? And so that's one bucket in terms of just the existing of the website. Then the other components that you want to look at and have been key is what are our acquisition costs? What is our CAC? What is the lifetime value of our customers? And the other layer, digging into more of that is, what is the overall lifetime profitability of our customers? What is first order profitability, which I mentioned earlier? And so those are kind of things to kind of get you to first foray in terms of how you look across the customer journey. So one element of that is okay, are you driving qualified traffic to your website? Is the traffic that you're driving going to the right locations? Are they dropping off at certain pages on your website because A, they thought they were getting something based on their entry source, or B, it's overall the page isn't really performing. And then the other element is, what is your kind of hook or promotion strategy to the customer? And so these all things translate in terms of when I work in DC, wake up in the first morning, you're looking at your data points, you're looking at what your sales were for the previous day, and all of these overall KPIs that help kind of set the trajectory of how you're going to optimize in both the short term, and then what are you trying to roll into the fold in the longer term. But I think the biggest thing, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of e-commerce, has really been sustainable growth, and growth that trying to, reduce as much your acquisition costs as possible. And if you are going to be in a place where you're in a category or just overall the nature of your business where your acquisition costs are going to be significantly high, how do you increase your repeat purchase rate? And so those are elements of thinking about e-commerce and leveraging the data. And I want to talk about this because I mentioned this earlier is, the overall kind of top level KPIs, I mentioned the conversion rate, traffic, et cetera, they all will kind of fold into the overall summary of things that also include the customer journey and brand building. So while traffic may drive today to the site, which may not necessarily lead to someone converting today, over time, that should be contributing overall to more people who are looking at your brand's consideration. That should lead to your conversion rate increasing over time. And I think one of the key things kind of when looking at data is purpose is to drive conversion today, and what is something purpose is to drive conversion at a later date. And being able to kind of split those two and having a point of view and for your brand is going to be very instrumental in the tactics and strategies that you develop.
Now, Amazon and other marketplaces really are becoming increasingly important for most brands. And so how do you advise companies to approach these platforms while still kind of maintaining their brand identity and their direct-to-customer experiences?
So I also think another component of this is I think we as brands have to be comfortable with not having as direct access to data points as we used to with our own website, as well as having those direct customer relationships as a vehicle of growth. And so that kind of comes to play in terms of playing in these marketplaces like Amazon, et cetera. Amazon's going to keep a lot of the information in a box. And the reality is that maybe in an area where we may not have as much data points about the customer. And so really fine tuning as you become, or if you already are an existing channel brand, is like, what is the so what? What is the reason why someone will buy on your brand website versus Amazon? So while Amazon may be the entry point, maybe there are distinctions in terms of your product assortment, the level of loyalty programs are another component of that. Things that kind of make it, there's incentives for a customer to buy from your brand site, even if their entry point is through Amazon. But I think the bigger thing, as I mentioned, is, brands being comfortable with that. We're not going to get as direct access to data points for the customers that are on Amazon. And that's just the reality. But as long as it's a profitable source of business for us and it's contributing to our overall top line of revenue, we just have to be comfortable with that reality.
Now, as a fractional executive and advisor, you likely encounter various organizational structures. And from your perspective, what leadership approaches have you found most effective in kind of fostering the necessary innovation and, I guess, driving growth from within these e-commerce teams?
And not only is it, okay to fail, but it's okay to fail quickly, learn quickly, and then adjust.
With BFCN and the Q4 holiday season, literally just around the corner, what are some of your top recommendations for brands to, I guess, number one, prepare for this season? And number two, how do you execute a successful BFCM campaign and strategy?
Same thing about Black Friday, Cyber Monday is that no matter what brand you're on, there's usually kind of status quo or what kind of execution looks like. And so the promos that were ran last year usually run the same, the following year with some kind of deviation. And so I think, and I'll speak specifically about the United States in this instance, is as we're approaching, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, I think it's going to be very critical to foster a lot of your leads well ahead of November. And I think, I would even say now. And so that's really, as I mentioned, kind of earlier in terms of consideration, this is a time to foster a lot of that relationship so that your brand is top of mind. And when you're coming out the ballpark with all of these promotions, et cetera, it's an easy kind of decision point for a customer to make. We also have to keep in mind, we're in an election year. So there's going to be a lot of increase in costs that potentially will happen in a lot of the marketing channels that we play. And now's the time to kind of test new ones and test ones that, whether that be Pinterest, whether it be TikTok, testing new ones as a lead generation strategy and not waiting till October. The time to do that is really in Q3 of this year ahead of November. And I think what I look at in terms of being prepared is being prepared to have a contingency plan. So obviously with any kind of business, you have your forecast either by day or even by week and by month, depending on what level of your business you run in terms of looking at daily, weekly, or monthly sales and forecasting that, but being able to pivot if you're not hitting your numbers. And so having backup plans and I would be prepared to have backup plans. And especially if you're a business in which Q4 is your biggest month of the year, for a lot of business, that's the case. You need to be prepared with that. And for programs that worked in the prior year that you did, there's no harm. And I think this really it's kind of safe to kind of do a lot of the variations of promos that you did the prior year. And at the end of the day, when customers are shopping, they're shopping for deals, they're shopping for gifts during this period of time, and you need to be able to play into that. So this is not the time. Obviously, you want to talk about the efficacy of your products, how well it does, but understand the mindset of what a customer is going to be doing in that period and how you communicate. This is almost a safe period to kind of be heavy on the discounting, be heavy on giveaways, be heavy on, whether it be full-size products, et cetera. But look beyond Black Friday and Cyber Monday is okay, for all of these people who are going to be making those purchases, who may be first-time purchases, who may be existing purchases in this period of time, what is our post-Black Friday and Cyber Monday strategy for those customers? And that is more key component. Because if you look at it, your margin is probably going to be a lot lower in that period of time. But the benefit of that is hey, we're getting new customers, we're getting the top line of revenue in terms of sales. And we also, as a brand, have a strategy for post-Cyber Monday.
Now, Temi, as we kind of wrap up for today's episode, are there any final pieces of advice or any kind of key takeaways that you would like to leave with our listeners? And where can people get a hold of you? I'd love to kind of share in the show notes, specifically if you like to be on Twitter or LinkedIn or direct. So just give you the opportunity to be able to let us know how we can learn more and get a hold of you.
Good question. So I think, the advice that I would give, and I kind of touched upon this over the course of this episode, is if you haven't done so already, thinking about D2C as like your sole growth lever and more of a sales channel as it is with any other sales channel. And so it plays in kind of the space of other channels and they feed off each other. And the other component is D2C has been a lot in the news for the past few years. And even from you think about where funds and investments going to is not the metrics and KPIs if you're looking at D2C businesses have shifted. And what I would say is D2C is not going away. Customers still like to shop online. Customers carry phones. There are literally things that access the internet with them for them to either make purchases or learn about things. And so it's never going away. I think how that channel plays within your brand is going to shift a little differently in terms of not being the sole source of growth and also just measuring and thinking about their growth more sustainably. And so that is one thing that I will look at. And I would say another advice that I would give is test and learn, and I know it sounds like cliche, but it's really this is an era where testing and learning is just going to be key. There's obviously foundational things that every business runs. There's a website that exists. There's a navigation that exists. There's paid media strategy, and it's finding what works for your brand. And it's not going to be the new shiny thing. It may not be. It could be for your brand. It may not. And you will learn that over the course of the time that you test and learn, and really not necessarily shy away from the data. The data will always be key in terms of running e-commerce business. But as I, kind of started off with this, is there are a lot of things that help brands grow that are not directly attributable, and being okay with kind of that dark space. And I think a lot of, I don't want to say the flailing, but some of that has occurred in the past 3 years is that companies and brands and even leaders have just been uncomfortable with their lack of ability to have the KPIs that are measured beforehand or the level of trackability. But I think, we can still run these businesses in the same way, we ran wholesale channels, other marketplaces, and just being able to kind of adjust with the times and where D2C kind of plays in your overall kind of brand strategy. In terms of connecting with me, I'm on LinkedIn. And so I'm under there as my full name as Temi Agbede. I'm there, feel free to connect with me there to learn more about the things that I've been doing, where I've been working, and also just, my thoughts on different things. And it's been a pleasure being on this episode today.
Well, Temi, thanks again for sharing incredible, valuable insights and your experience with our listeners today.
And thank you for having me on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Well, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank you personally for being a loyal listener of eCommerce Fastlane. It's my hope that this podcast is offering you a ton of value through growth strategies, tactics, and exclusive insider tips on the best Shopify apps and marketing platforms, all with my personal goal to help you build, manage, grow, and scale a successful and thriving company powered by Shopify. Thanks for investing some time today and listening to the show. I'm so proud and excited that you have a growth mindset and are a constant learner. I truly appreciate you and your entrepreneurial journey. Enjoy the rest of the week and keep thriving with Shopify.